Morning, dear friends. Today is the 20th of ER. It's Sunday, the 2nd of May. 2nd of May, and we are learning Maseches. We're learning Gemara. We're going through the entire Shas. We're currently learning Maseches Shabbos. We are in the fourth chapter of Maseches Shabbos. We've just begun the chapter of Bamet Toimnin, and the Mishnayos that we are analyzing currently are all about the laws of Hatmana, as we discussed on Friday. And Thursday, there are restrictions regarding insulating food, certainly on Shabbos, but also on Erev Shabbos, there are certain materials, substances that one may insulate their food that's hot, and other substances that are restricted for insulating food on Erev Shabbos to Shabbos. Rashi set it up for us. Rabbi Steinsaltz gave us an even more elaborate setup. We discussed the laws of the heating up the food on a stove, and there are conditions that it can be on, it can't be on. Well, suppose Erev Shabbos you take it up and you come to do Hatmana. Well, here are the rules that we need to be mindful of. So that is really in the broadest sense what we're discussing in the Mishnah, in the Gemara. We began by discussing on Friday, we discussed a little bit more about why some of these substances are problematic. We started trying to define different kinds of pulp, as you recall, from the oil creating process. And then we told an interesting story about Rabba and Rav Zera, who went to the Reish Galus's house, and they witnessed a servant who was doing stuff, and Rabba, 2 occasions, rebuked him and told him he better cut it out. He has to stop. And Rav Zera and Rabba discussed what the issues potentially were, in actuality were. And again, without rehashing the whole discussion, we went through a series of potentially prohibited acts on Shabbos, and that was Friday's Gemara. All right, so now we're going to continue going forward in Gemara, but first I would like to mention that we're dedicating our learning today to the Neshama of David ben Avram, a family in the community who just lost their father, so we'll dedicate our learning for the Shiva of David ben Avram, and we'll also dedicate it for Larry, who was Litman. Let me see if I can get his exact name spelling, and then we'll jump into the Gemara. Litman Shloima ben Aryeh Yaakov. Karma should have an aliyah. Lastly, we are praying for the healing of all of Klal Yisrael, and of course the mishpacha and loved ones of the Chaverim, members of this chat, and of course we're very mindful to put our prayers forward for those that need healing in the aftermath of the Ron, and certainly in the Ilay Nishmas, all of the holy, beautiful neshamas who were taken from us in the midst of Simcha Shel Mitzvah and celebrating the Hilul of Rashbi. Their neshamas should, you know what? Hashem knows how to take care of those neshamas, but we'll put our learning l'schusam and l'ilui nishmasam. Now I'm going to share the screen and jump into the Gemara. Thank you all for being here. Here we go. Are you ready? Our Mishnah continues with a list of items that may not be used for Hatmana insulation, and the Mishnah says, "V'loy b'teven." Let's just jump up to the Mishnah for a moment. Here is the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, "Ameh toimnim v'mein toimnim." We had the first list, and then the Mishnah continues, "Loy b'teven, loy b'zagin, loy b'moichin." You cannot use straw, grape residue, the stuff that's after the grapes are crushed, the skins and the seeds and all the residue of the grapes, not with soft material, we'll see momentarily what that is, and nor with grasses when they are moist, but when they're dry, they're entirely acceptable. So again, the Mishnah gave a series of items that are prohibited even when they are dry. That was the first part of the Mishnah, and then the second part of the Mishnah is a list of items that can be used when they are dry, but may not be used when they are moist, when they are wet. And as we discussed, on Friday, the moisture triggers whatever chemical reaction to cause it to be creating heat in a manner that is potentially problematic on Shabbos. And of course, Alan, it's good to have our chemist on standby to explain to us all of the chemistry-related, chemical-related matters of our Gemara. So don't go anywhere.
Shucks, Rabbi, it was nothing.
Listen, when it comes to medical stuff, we'll turn to our doctors. When it comes to matters of chemistry and pharmaceuticals, we are going to lean on you heavily. All right, the Gemara says, the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to use teben and the other items that we just reviewed. One of those items is moichin, which we translated here, soft material. Stand by, Rashi's going to give us some words. So now let's see. Ada Bar Masna queried, he asked a problem, a question. What's the question? A halachic question. Suppose you took these scraps or these materials, and we'll see exactly what it is in a moment. Suppose you used them to insulate your pot of chicken soup or whatever else it might be. So are those scraps, are they muktzah? Are you allowed to carry them on Shabbos? Or are they not? Anybody here want to throw out why there would be a question if these scraps would be muktzah or not? Any theories?
Well, it could be because since they're doing a chemical reaction to create heat, they're like a heat source.
Hold on. We said you cannot use them when they're moist because they might create additional heat. But when they're dry, you can use them. So you're allowed to use it for atman. I know where you're going. You're going to say if it's a prohibited use, then it should be muktzah. Granted. But suppose it's a permissible use. Rav Ada Bar Masna is asking if it's muktzah. I'm sorry, if you're allowed to carry. Those are the words he uses. So what would be the background?
They had no use, complete no use. Obviously.
Hold on, they had no use or they have a use? You're using it, right?
They have a use. You can play with them if you're allowed to.
So here's what we need to know. Apparently these materials, although I refer to them as scraps, they're nothing but scraps. It seems like they're freshly processed material that are going to be used eventually for creating something. And they had a degree of value, depending on which of the mefarshim that we explore.
Could be used as well, for
so
example.
stamazoi, regularly, they don't have a function. That's what Rabbi Steinsaltz says here. They're set aside. They have no use. Alternatively, they are a high value, and therefore you're not going to use them for random items. So the question is, now that you've chosen to use them for insulating your chicken soup, does that remove them from being considered muktzah? Are they no longer removed from our arsenal of items that we're going to use on Shabbos, and they are no longer muktzah? Or do they remain muktzah because essentially they are items that don't have use aside for the specific function that they're serving to insulate? Rabbi Steinsaltz, actually, let's see his words. Ordinarily, materials are set aside. They're muktzah. They have no use. Usually, moving them on Shabbos is prohibited. Now we've used them for Atmana. Do they lose their status as muktzah, set aside? Are they now considered a keli? Are they now considered something of function or not? That's the question. So, folks, you thought we're going to escape the discussion of muktzah to talk about Atmana, but not to worry. We're going to hold on to the best of our ability. It's going to continue to be a factor that resonates throughout the Gemara. Amar lei, so Abaye responded to the questioner. Do you think just because he doesn't have cheap insulation material, he's no longer interested in his materials? Clearly, he doesn't want to waste.
Ken Gruber says
or
two elevators are down.
He doesn't want to diminish.
Up and down.
Hang on, let's do this. Mute. Oh, folks, you know how to unmute yourself. If any questions or comments, please do so.
Somebody has to mute. There's background noise.
No, I hit mute just now, so everyone will have to now manually unmute. So just because you've used it for insulation, it doesn't mean that, and we're going to see Rashi's explanation in a moment, it doesn't mean that you're now uninterested in preserving the quality of your materials. Let's see Rashi. Eino elo lasos mehem levadim shekorin palter. Really, they're only used for, it's a specialty. We're using this material for a specific purpose, and therefore they cannot be used, or they're typically not used for other functions. And they cannot be carried. Now that we've chosen, this Rashi I think actually belongs on the earlier Gemara, but anyways, these materials, just because they've used for Atmana, doesn't mean that they're free game. Now let's do our favorite activity. Hold on. Let's look up our French. Alan, do you have an English word for, or a French word in Canada for palter? Can you try to surmise a French word? Or should we look up what Rashi is trying to tell us?
Yes.
We'll do this for fun. I hope you don't mind. Shabbos. Almost there. And by just a moment. Okay. Here we go. Oh, here we go. Feltress, felt. Is there such a word in modern French?
No.
Not that I know of, but anyway.
All right, well, it looks like this word is some kind of high-grade sheets, bedding, and
Almost
therefore,
goes with the English word felt. Felt,
right,
you
I'm
know,
saying
felt.
that, and so it sounds like it must be an associated with the English word felt, which I think comes from a French word, correct? And Alan, no?
No, I don't. I've never heard of this word in French.
What is felt? What is felt? Maybe it's like pelts. Pelts like animal furs.
Depends.
No.
Depends who's doing the feeling.
Mm.
It's like it's just these days we have it in fleece blankets almost, but it's you know, I think it's a better quality. The fleece almost feels just like it.
It's a heavy material. It's a heavier material.
It won't
What's
scratch.
felt in English? Is that how you spell it?
That's the word.
Felt,
F-E-L-T.
fabric.
Yeah.
What type of fabric is felt? Felt is a textile material produced by matting. I don't think the felt of our Gemara is the felt of our modern age. Felt can be made of natural fibers, wool, animal fur, or synthetic fibers. Maybe it is. So again, we have these materials. Typically, they're going to be used for creating bedding. They're set aside. We're not going to waste them for shmatas, for rags. For rags, you'll use rags. So now you've chosen, and therefore it usually has no use on Shabbos. Some of the commentaries, and I think Rashi appears to be saying that it might be called muksa machmas chesron. No, Rashi is not saying that. Others say muksa machmas chesron kis, an item of value that would be devalued by handling any other way than its intended purpose is muksa. You can't use it on Shabbos because you typically don't intend to use it for another purpose. But whatever the case is, the question is, are these felts, are these materials muksa now that they've been used for insulation or not? So here is a proposed answer. Perhaps this will help us out. We have a brisa that might give us some guidance. There's a brayta that talks about with which materials one may insulate, one may do atmana. And the brisa mentions wool, combed wool, a certain type of dyed wool, and our muchin, our soft material. But you may not carry them. Again, a brisa that tells us all these materials can be used for insulation, cannot be used for carrying. What does this seem to indicate? Mark, what does this tell us about if felt is muksa, even if it's used for atmana?
Then
It's muksa. So this strongly supports what Abaya is suggesting, that just because you use the material in the process of insulating your food, it doesn't mean that it becomes no longer muksa. And the text says clearly, you can use it for atmana, but don't carry it. Doesn't that seem to resolve clearly and explicitly what Abaye
I think
said?
that felt would be a material you could use it for soft, like to pad a pillow or something even.
Right?
Or to,
I'm
or to
sorry.
rest,
Therefore, what?
therefore it would have a purpose on Shabbos. You could rest your head on it. For example,
Mark, I'm so
soft.
happy you said that. You were mechav in the next discussion, the Gemara. Are you allowed to stuff a pillow on Shabbos?
But then again, Rabbi, you open up a whole can of worms, because how can you leave it to each individual to determine? One guy will say, for me, it's this. Another guy will say, for me, it's not.
Hold on. We have to be clear. There's a
You
certain.
have to have some rules.
No. There's a certain component of muktzah which is highly personal. A person can not set aside. A person can decide that they're going to use something on Shabbos, and there are certain ways and circumstances where you can make something.
Yeah, but we're not talking about ways. We're talking about
based on your intention.
makeup of the item.
No, we're asking if you choose to take an item that you don't typically use, and you took it and you used it on Shabbos or for the purpose of Shabbos, and you've downgraded in a sense. These materials, as Abaye says, you could have used straw, which is $2 for a whole bale. And instead you use these muchin, which each piece is $2. Let's say. So you're choosing to use this high value item. So does that mean that you are declaring with your actions that this item is no longer set aside for its exclusive use? Does it mean that you're comfortable using it for other functions and therefore it loses its muksa status? Because you used it?
A wealthy person considers it garbage. A poor person has a use for it.
But the difference here, you're harking back to our Friday discussion, Wednesday discussion, which we spoke about how a poor person could perceive a material as garbage and an ani could perceive it as valuable. That's true. There are certain circumstances. I mean, that was the story of Rebbe, right? And the incense, the crumbs of the incense, whatever you call it. Here we're talking about a specific material which has a conventional use. And we want to know if you choose to break and use it for an atypical, unconventional use, such as insulation, does it lose its muktzah status or not? Rashi, our initial reading of this Braita is as follows. Although they've been used for insulation, and they are still muktzah, like Abaye. Rebberal clearly does not like Abaye's opinion, and he's disturbed by this Braisa. And let's see if anybody supports your perspective. The Gemara expresses Rebbeal's opinion in Mishum Ha Lo Irya. This text is not going to make it. This text does not really make your case. Why? Because read the text one more time. Hachi Kamar. This is really what the Braisa is saying. You can use them for Hatmana. Imloy Tamad Bahem, but if you haven't used them, Ein Metaltal and Oisai, they would otherwise remain muktzah. Umili mili ktani, and our Braisa is coming. I'm reading Rashi now, and our Braisa is coming to teach us two separate items. Katani bereisha ashmeino the toimin behem. We're teaching one halacha of these muchin, of these soft materials, which is it can be used for hatmana on erev Shabbos, because they do not generate additional heat. While we're talking about these soft pieces of material, ashmin and seifa, we're also afforded the opportunity to see the latter. Say, look at the second half of the Mishnah. Stam muchin muktzais. You should know that typically these soft materials, which are used for specialty high-end bedding, are typically muktzah. Obviously, if you use them, have a kimisha yichta lakach, then it's like you've explicitly designated that they'd be used for hatmana, and now they have a function that would make them potentially not muktzah. So let's just recap the thought process here. We asked the question, what's the deal? Are muchin muktzah or not? This material is muktzah or not? What's the shaila? So the shaila is, usually they're muktzah. Usually they're a specialty item. They're only used for the creation of this bedding. If it's not yet been put into the bedding, it's going to be set aside. However, now that you've chosen to use it for hatmana, for insulation, does it lose its muktzah status or not? That was our question. Abaye said it should absolutely not lose its muktzah status because although you've used it to insulate your pot, it remains the kind of item that you don't want to downgrade, and therefore you're not going to use it for anything else. It should remain muktzah. And the Gemara has a potential text to support Abaye's assertion that those materials would remain muksa. What's the proof? The brisa that says you could use these materials for hatmana, for insulation in Erev Shabbos, but yet they remain muksa. Ein metalton oisem. The Gemara says this text is inconclusive because it is possible that you take out the word yet it remains muksa and just say as follows. You're allowed to use these items for hatmana. However, generally speaking, you should know they remain muksa, and the only time they become unmuksa is when you set them aside for the use of hatmana. So that's the Gemara so far. Gemara says, "Ihachi ma'ila memra." If that's the case, that we're talking about it doesn't make sense to say the Gemara now is challenging. So Beryl, your position was expressed, but some of you are disturbed by this reading, this explanation. It's still not the instinctive, intuitive way to read the text. And so the Gemara says, no. This doesn't feel right. Why do you even mention its muksa status? We're talking about hatmana. And that's our broader question, right? We're talking about hatmana in our Gemara. We're all of a sudden talking about muksa. So the Gemara says simple. You might think now that we've taken these soft padding material and we've used it for hatmana, you might suppose there's another function that's within the realm of predictable and reasonable, and that is you might use it to pad your seat. If anybody's tried to sit on a hard bench or a hard chair, you might know that you'd want a cushion is a good thing to have. And so there's a havamina, there's a possible presumed use, that of softening your seat. Actually, I take that back. I'm not sure in the time of the Gemara if we were talking about padding a bench. Probably we're talking about putting it on the floor and sitting on the floor. But whatever. Kamash Malan, the text teaches us that it remains muksa, it is muksa. So again, we brought a text which seems to point to the fact that they remain muksa. We brought a reading that indicated that it is not necessarily so. Maybe the muksa would be if it was not used for hatmana. And ultimately, the Gemara says, yeah, that could be. And the reason why we mention its muksa status at all is because there's a svar, there's a havamina that's not muksa, and therefore we're letting you know that it remains muksa, although it can be used for hatmana Erev Shabbos. This is the first round, the first discussion of today's Gemara. Now we're going to come to the next point, which is, I forgot, Mark, was this your question? Your mamash were mechaven to the next discussion, the Gemara. Okay.
Yes.
So what's the next?
Even whether you put it in a pillow or you just lean your head on it, because
So let's see. We're immediately going to be talking about pillows now. So I don't know how you had Ruach HaKodesh to think of that, but here we're right.
No,
I
didn't think ahead either.
And you didn't even sneak ahead. So it's mamash Ruach HaKodesh, or your mind is being rewired. Maybe not rewired. Maybe your mind was always wired, but our minds are being wired to think like the Gemara does. That's a fantastic achievement. Rav Chisda. There was a story of Chisda, Shar La'aduri Udra, L'Beisadia, B'Shabbos. Rav Chisda allowed, let's see Rashi, L'Achzir Mochin Shenaflu Min HaKar L'Tochan, to restore, to return the fallen out soft padded stuffing of your pillow on Shabbos. It seems like in the time of the Gemara they didn't use goose feathers. Is that possible?
They probably didn't have zippers to keep it in.
It didn't have zippers, you're saying. So these larger wool, whatever you call them, these larger, soft muchin were probably more ideal for a pillow. All right. So he would allow the stuffing from inside a pillow to be restored on Shabbos. Why would you suppose that it should be a problem? Anyone want to guess what the problem of putting the stuffing in a pillow would be? It's connected to something we discussed not long ago.
You've got to sew it in.
Well, today
Or
you'd have
sew
to
it
sew.
to see.
Well, let's say maybe there's a zipper, or maybe there's Velcro. Okay, I know there was no zipper or Velcro in the time of the Mishnah.
Maybe with the candelabra, putting together pieces apart.
Yeah. So what was the problem with that?
putting it together is work.
Building.
Creating a
Improving.
vessel, or maybe, creating a vessel. Remember, we used the word makabeh patish, finalizing the function of a vessel. And so is stuffing your pillow, making something. Are you being an ois? Is it considered asiyas kli? Are you fashioning a utensil? That would be the reason to prohibit it. Rav Chisda clearly doesn't believe that to be the case.
Well, here you're putting it back in because it fell out.
So Mark says, so hold on. So explain what you just said. What would be the difference between building a new pillow and returning stuffing to your presently?
When stuffing falls out, you're just restoring it. You're not creating new. Matter of fact, if you read down, it actually says about a shirt. You can untie one that's been previously tied.
So you saw the Gemara. Okay. So I was trying to figure out if you predicted the Gemara or you saw the Gemara. Okay, good.
You're not improving. You're not improving anything.
Oh no, Mark just said very good. Mark just said very good. There's a distinction between, and we'll see this unfold in a moment. There's a distinction between the initial creation of a vessel and just putting a little stuffing back in. You could be missing the stuffing. The pillow. Well, let's see. Eisvei Rav Chanan Bar Chisda Rav Chisda. Rav Chanan asked Rav Chisda. He said, "There's a teaching. There's a brayso that says, Matirim beisavar b'Shabbos avaloi poischin. You're allowed to untie, to open up the closed up neck of a shirt, but you cannot open it up." Rashi explains, Shederach HaKoivsim LeKoishran. Again, first of all, I have a feeling people didn't clean their clothing that frequently, but in order to clean the clothing, it seems like they would stitch up or seal up somehow the neck of a garment, right? So however they would do it, Matir Beisav Shabbos, you're allowed to open up this shirt, the neck. I don't think it's actually a shirt. Rabbi Stein also used such shirts, but I don't know if they had shirts back then. But whatever the garment is, you're allowed to open up the neck, to untie it, but you're not allowed to open it lichatchila. What does that mean? It seems like the material was made initially in one piece of material, right? Even today, you take material, you cut it up, and you make it into a garment. So it appears that initially it was closed, and in order to make a shirt work, you do need to create places for the head to go and the arms, right? So you'd be allowed to reopen it, but you're not allowed to open it lechatchila for the very first time. Let's see if we can get some explanation on the historic nature of how these garments were cleaned.
We need a picture of the shirt.
You think in Pompeii they found the shirts of what people wore in
Pompeii, right? a lot of starch in those shirts.
Listen, Pompeii has done us many favors in understanding different items from our Gemara. However, I don't know if they found shirts, original shirts from.
By now.
So, Rabbi, that's why Chabad doesn't wear a tie.
Why? Because of the shaila of making a knot. Plenty of Chabadniks wear ties. Floridian Chabadniks are not into wearing ties. Let's see if Rabbi Steindels can give us some good contemporary context. Bear with me a moment.
But seriously, Rabbi, the interesting thing is if somebody had a shaila today about some kind of tie, to Paskin, you'd go back here to our Mishnah and our Gemara.
In a sense, yes. I mean, not this exact Gemara. We would have to go to the Gemara that talks about knots, tying knots, and which kind of knots are okay and not. But correct.
It depends if you want to come with a solution to tie it or you want to come with a solution not to wear it.
Just bear with me a moment. See if Rabbi Steindels can. Anyway, suffice it to say, this was the nature of how the garments were done. This makes a lot of sense. I think we missed the Tosfos. Hold on, did we?
Yeah, Tosfos is great.
Hold on.
Got it.
Hold on. Here we go. Here, this is a Tosfos. Forget the whole context of Tosfos. Just take a look over here. The be'inyan shehu regilos litkay v'likshar. Maybe it wasn't this Tosfos. Anyways, here's the bottom line. It seems like people would give their clothing to a launderer to clean them, but they didn't want people to the guy to wear the clothing. You give a designer suit to wash. And meanwhile, the dry cleaner is walking around like a macha wearing this designer suit. It's kind of like, when you give your car to the valet, if you give your sports car to the valet, you know that they're going to be driving up and down the street, or they might be. So they would stitch up the neck to prevent abuse and unauthorized use of the garment. Right? Is that what it says? Yeah. Rogil likshar space of savar kadei lo ideal about beged shel love shadam. Okay, no. Let's reframe that. It seems like perhaps either the owner would do it, or maybe the launderer would close it up so that no one would accuse him of wearing the garment.
Unless maybe
So now Beryl's asking the question. Oh, we thought you said tying is prohibited and untying is prohibited, and here we're saying that there might be a license to open up the garment or not. So we know that there's a distinction between a long-lasting knot, a kesher shel kayama, and a temporary knot. Right? That would be the reason why some people will permit tying your shoelaces on Shabbos, because it's not a kesher shel kayama.
Rabbi, there's no end when you pull a thread, so you have the ties that are pre-made. That's better or worse?
I don't know. I want to move away from the tie discussion for the moment. All right, let's get back into our Gemara. Anyways, here's the deal. We have a question. Are you allowed to restuff your pillow? Rav Chisda allowed it. His son, I think it's his son, challenged him. There's a brisa that says that you're not allowed to open up a garment. Here's the punchline. You're not allowed to stuff your pillow or your blanket or the quilt or a cushion. You're not allowed to stuff these pillows with our soft stuffing material. You're not allowed to do the stuffing. So Rav Chisda says, no problem, put it back in. Hanan Bar Chisda says, hang on, I have an open, explicit brisa that says you're not allowed to do so. How do you go against a?
No, it's not the same thing.
Why not?
One of them is replacing. The other one is maybe making a pillow altogether from the beginning.
Oh, this is what I said, that we already have Talmidei Chacham that predict the style of the Gemara. So here we go. Loi kasha. This brisa does not contradict or conflict with the psak halacha, the directive of Rav Chisda. Habechadati, habatiki. There's a solid distinction between a brand new pillow and an old pillow. Rashi. Bechadati. If they never existed, they were never stuffed, you can't put it in now. The hashta avid leimana, in this moment, he's creating a vessel. Ba'atiki, but if it's an old pillow or an old cushion, then you're just restoring the stuffing to the pillow, which recently fell out.
You're still filling a vessel.
But you're not. The point is, you're not creating the vessel, and so there's a distinction between. Here's the thing. There's again, this I don't know if it's necessary to understand the Gemara, but I think we can appreciate that there's a strong distinction between the standard of quality and the necessary degree of stuffness, of your pillow, if it's brand new or if it's your own pillow. When you're making it the first time, you have a certain expectation. But forget that for a moment. Very simply, when you're filling up the first time, you're still creating the keli. And the last stuffing that you put in, now you've made it into a vessel, the vessel being a pillow or a cushion. But when the stuffing falls out, and maybe some of you have experienced this, maybe a pillow has a few feathers fly out. Well, if you could put it back in, that would be nice. Or some of the stuffing falls out, that would be nice. But you may yet be using it, and therefore that's not an act of creating a kli, creating a vessel. Let's see, Rabbi Steinsaltz here chimes in. Oh, interesting. He's not talking about the essential matter. He's talking about the connectivity between this halacha and the next. Because even though this is the discussion of misakin kli or building a vessel, as opposed to our discussion of hatman or muksa. But he says that it's essentially connected. So that's not relative. That's not. Oh, the Ron asks a very obvious question. I'm surprised no one here asked this question. Didn't we just establish that these mochin are muksa? Remember? So how would you ever come to stuff your pillow?
The whole idea was that if you had a purpose for them, then they weren't muksa anymore.
Oh, so you're saying that you were miyachid them, you designated them to be involved in a pillow. No, but the simple answer is because they were already inside the pillow, and because they're already inside the pillow, they're already no longer sitting aside and waiting to be put into a pillow, and therefore they're already part of a greater vessel, and therefore they're not muksa. Anyway, it's just something interesting. Okay, Tanya Nami Hachi. Indeed, we have a brisa which makes exactly the above mentioned distinction. One is prohibited from placing the stuffing into a pillow or a cushion on Shabbos or Yantiv. Nashru, if it fell out, then you may put it in. And obviously the same would apply to Yantiv. So we explicitly have a brisa which distinguishes between the circumstances of fashioning a new vessel or simply re-stuffing an old vessel, an old key. Now we're going to revisit our discussion about the opening up the collar, the neck, the shirt, the neck of the garment. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Yehuda taught in the name of Rav. He quoted Rav as teaching. A person opens a new neck opening on Shabbos. Chayiv chatas. This act would be a biblical problem because by cutting open or opening again, I don't have the exact. Maybe someone here can explain for us the exact situation of what this garment looked like. But suppose I'm assuming maybe they had to cut open a neck or they had to finish it or expand it, create it the right size. So by doing so, you're now making the shirt functional as a shirt or as a garment, and therefore you're literally creating a vessel. Maybe you're being misakin kli, maybe it's makeh b'patish or boine, depending on how you understand this Gemara. The point is, you're making a vessel. You're making a kli. Rashi apaseach beisavar shel cholek lechatchila. We're talking about the first time you're opening up the neck of a garment. You notice Rashi doesn't say shirt; he says a garment or a coat. Chayiv chatos. You'd be liable to bring a sin offering, which means that it's a biblical problem. The hashta kemash v'leimona. You're literally making it into a garment. V'chayiv mishom makeh b'patish v'hainu gemar melacha. By making the garment usable, this is what we call makeh b'patish. It's the final act to bring the vessel, the keli, up to code, to make it functional, and that is the gemar melacha that makes this thing functional. And therefore, this is a big problem. That is the teaching of Rav. Rav Kana challenges Rav's teaching and says, we have other stuff that you're allowed to open and it's not a problem. What is that other stuff? Now, those that were part of our Avodah Zarah study group back in the days of pre-COVID yeshiva nights, this might be slightly familiar. Ma bein zol lemegufas chavis. What is the difference between opening a shirt and opening a barrel of wine? I don't know if you recall, we talked about chopping off the top of the barrel of the wine. Remember that?
Yeah. The thing is, though, opening wine is food. You have more leeway when you're opening something for food.
Maybe, but let's see. So what's the distinction? Why are we distinguishing between opening the neck of a shirt and making the barrel accessible? The Tanya of Perchavis Shenishbra, we learn later on in Masechah Shabbos, in the context of the laws of Shabbos. Maseches Avodah Zarah for more broad discussions about wine production and the kashrus of wine. Maybe Adam Chavis Umatis is Roisha Bisayav. We're taught later in the Gemara in the Mishnah and Shabbos that a person is allowed to have a barrel and chop off the top of the barrel with a knife, with a sword. And it will be presented and available for the guests, for the visitors. What's the difference between opening a shirt and opening the barrel? Steinsaltz translates it the stopper of a barrel, which Chazal permit piercing on Shabbos to provide wine. By piercing the covering, it turns into a kli. And particularly the way the Mishnah describes it, it sounds like you're cutting off the entire top of the barrel. So Gemara says simply, Amar le Rava, Rava says, big difference. Zeh chibur, v'zeh einoi chibur. The covering is incomparable because, see how Steinsaltz explains it. The cut in the shirt is the garment, is the connection of the garment itself, whereas by the barrel, the stopper is really a separate. Rashi says, it's really not part of the barrel. It's a separate item that's been fused or put on top of it. And so you're not opening the vessel, you're just removing an external interfering cover. And because the whole way the barrel is designed is that this thing will be removed for consumption, the secondary covering, it's not considered misakin kli. You're not making the vessel. The vessel remains as is. All you're doing is pulling off this external covering. This discussion, which I don't want to get into at length simply because I'm not read up enough to give you a fully educated share on this. But this brings to the question that there are certain kinds of food containers, and I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. There are certain kinds of food containers that are entirely closed and are entirely sealed, and perhaps by opening them, we might consider if we are fashioning a new vessel or not. And so, for example, again, I'm not giving you a psak halacha, just throwing out this thought. There are considerations when opening cans, metal cans of food. Can you open up a can, and are there ways that one would be able to or not be able to do so out of this exact concern of being misakin kli? Because whereas this barrel, again, I'm not telling you what to do and not to do on Shabbos, I'm just throwing this out there for us to consider academically. The barrel, the covering is a separate material, but what if it is one solid unit, and then perhaps removing it could be forming a vessel of sorts? But at least in this part, in this Gemara, we are unchallenged, or we managed to deal with this challenge by explaining the distinction between a garment that's a sealed piece of fabric, or maybe this fabric was never opened and you're cutting open the fabric, you're opening it for the very first time, and a barrel that is not the case.
Rabbi, it's
Yes.
it's very interesting. I saw a plastic square container, and when you take off the cover have holes in it to be like a cup holder. It's funny because I just saw it for the first time. Be interesting.
You're saying, again, it's a food container.
Yeah, and the cover, instead of being flat inside, has grooves so that you take the food and you can put the cover down and use it as a cup holder.
Aha. See, today's technology is wonderful.
Yeah.
And but it does present questions that we might have otherwise not considered. It does create complex circumstances when it comes to
I just happened to look at it. I was trying to figure out what's the idea. I imagine if you put tea or something in there and you're going to have hot water beside you, it's terrific. Take out the cover and put it right on top.
Dr. Hammer, go ahead.
A couple of issues. One, what about buttoning and unbuttoning the shirt from the laundry, or a new shirt which is packaged and buttoned, and could throw in addition to that, you might find a little pin sometimes also. But forgetting about that, let's just first focus on comes from the laundry, and they're all buttoned. You have 8 buttons there, and they're all buttoned to the top. And of course, when you unbutton it, it's possible that you could rip something. Sometimes is it permissible? I assume it is.
I do not believe what we are discussing here is buttons.
Right.
It seems
Okay.
like they would stitch up they would thread up the garment.
Okay.
Now, it also seems to me that cleaning clothing must have been a very, very exciting, momentous moment in your year or month. I don't think they were laundering clothing the same,
Right. Okay.
the same
Right.
extent as we are. Imagine if we had to stitch up our clothing, seal up our clothing every time we were laundering. I think it would.
Okay. I figured it probably is not buttoning because it's too much.
It would inflate the cost of laundering beyond an already outrageous.
Yeah. So next issue.
You go ahead.
Opening up a bottle of wine.
Yes.
Now, forgetting about the corkscrew, even before that, there's a sometimes metal ring around the top. Wine, even liquor.
Yes.
What's the issue there compared to what we're dealing with?
There are a number of potential items to consider, but broadly speaking, it is acceptable. The main consideration that people should consider is, number one, if there are letters that are going to be, or words that are going to be tampered with. And there are certain circumstances where it is preferred to open up a bottle prior to Shabbos to avoid all shilots. And we'll discuss that more at length when we come to the Gemara that talks about writing and other elements of the construction of vessels. Tosfos here, I don't want to go through the whole Tosfos here, but Tosfos does ask some factual questions, which maybe you're wondering, especially if you were part of our study of wine back then, which is that this idea of using a knife to chop open the barrel seems to indicate that you're probably cutting part of the barrel too. And but suffice it to say, either way, what's happening ultimately is the opening is pre-existing. Alternatively, Tosfos brings out, and you may remember this, we spoke about how it was done for style, it was done for effect. You wanted to show I'm so generous, I'm not just going to open a little spigot, I'm going to chop open the whole, I'm going to open the whole thing. Anyways, there's more to discuss, but let's leave it at this for now. You know what?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I think in those days they to cover it, to seal the bottle of wine, they used tar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this way you don't have to cut anything. The tar is always soft. So they just twisted it off. In other words, the cork was put in and tar was put around it to seal it.
And then the
And
tar
they
would
just-
harden.
That's but it never hardened to the point where you could where you'd have to use a knife to cut it.
Well, again, I think the knife was done more for style and dramatic effect.
Yeah.
The point is that the covering is of a different substance and material than the barrel itself. Right?
Could be.
All right, let's do a recap of today's Gemara. We didn't cover a lot of ground, but we went through some very important subjects and some new items for consideration. So today's Gemara really was dominated by two discussions, which it really is one discussion. The first discussion was all about the mochin, about these scraps, and particularly we were inquiring about their status, if you're allowed to use them on Shabbos or not. Typically, if they haven't been deployed in their conventional function in bedding or whatever your use was, they would typically be very delicate and high value, and they wouldn't be used for other purposes. So our question is, now that it's been used for insulation, does it lose its muktzah status? Abaya indicates that it would remain muktzah. He was challenged. He brought a brisa, or Gemara brings a brisa, which seems to support that those items remain muktzah. The Gemara then challenges this assertion, saying that it doesn't make sense that we're talking about these items when they were, let's see, with the Gemara, apparently it leaves this as the text is inconclusive, but ultimately the Gemara or at least Abaya, is comfortable maintaining that these are muksa. And even though you might think that there's another use, maybe you'll use them to sit on, they ultimately are not used to sit on unless they are within the context of a cushion. And so it appears from this Gemara anyways, that they would remain muksa by virtue of the fact that you don't have much use for them. Obviously, one could fully designate that they do have a function prior to Shabbos and then they would be allowed to use, but just using it for Atmana, at least in this point of the Gemara, it seems like they would remain muksa. The Gemara then moved on to talk about stuffing a pillow, and the Gemara explained and established the distinction between fashioning a new bedding item or pillow, which is entirely prohibited, and restoring and putting it back inside, which would be permissible. This was the Psaka of Chisda, and ultimately we find the Braisa that entirely supported that prospect. And lastly,
Rabbi, if we had the Baraita, why do we go through the whole argument? I mean, obviously they're aware of a Baraita, the Chacham.
no, not always. You're asking a good question. This is discussed, but it's not necessarily the case that all of the Mishnah was known by everyone in the time of the Gemara, but it's not necessarily the case. And this you see especially in the Rishonim that discuss the Gemara, and even more so in the Achronim. It's quite possible.
You could start with the
not
Baraita.
but it's the Braitot were brought, and it doesn't seem like necessarily every student of the Talmud or every sage of the
Okay,
Talmud.
but why bring it at the end? As soon as the argument starts, somebody brings the Baraita, don't argue. Here's the law, black and white.
Well, first of all, not always, but in this context, the Braisa is being brought as a supporting text. It's like in a law, you might have a certain, even in contemporary law, you might have a certain ruling, and you'll bring other precedent and case law to support it. And so now that we have the Psak Rav Chisda, he's being challenged by a Braisa, and ultimately, or not in this case, where ultimately we find a Braisa that supports and creates an earlier precedent to support it. We are being provided with the full conversation, so that we emerge even more enlightened and informed about not only the halacha, but we are informed about the process that brought us to that point of deciding the halacha. Dr. Hammer, you were going to ask something?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, so then that was, so again, the second item was the distinction between a new pillow and an old pillow. And I guess we could say the third item that we discussed today was comparing and contrasting the opening of a shirt for the first time to be worn, to be used, which we considered misak and kli, or the words of Rashi, kamash v'le mana, you're making a vessel. It's the same thing in Aramaic, and that's different than opening of a barrel, which although the barrel is sealed, the covering of the barrel is not an essential component. It's not the same material as the barrel.
So maybe
Hold on. I'm sorry. Other Mefarshim, I just want to throw this in. Other Mefarshim explain the distinction a little differently. They say very simply, opening a garment, the neck of your coat, or the opening for your head in your garment, is done with precision. It's meant to be functional and smooth and with precision. Opening a barrel, you're not opening the barrel to have a quality, well-finished vessel. If you're slicing it wildly with a knife, it's your intention is just to be generous in the presentation of the wine, not and so that would be another explanation that's brought about why they might be permissible. Those are the three items discussed today. Or barrel.
Rabbi,
Yes, go ahead.
Can't we use the barrel thing to answer Beryl Alevi's question about a bottle of wine? Wouldn't you say that's similar? The way you could take out the cork from the barrel.
Certainly. But I think this would certainly be the first step to understanding that it is acceptable to open a barrel. The reason why I didn't bring it again is because Dr. Hammer was asking this question after already knowing this, Marcia. He was saying that even though we know generally speaking you can open it, but are there other Reb David Tiskele Mitzvot? Thank you. There are other considerations we need to take into account, and that I think was what Dr. Hammer was getting at, which is even now that we've established that opening a bottle isn't the equivalent of creating a bottle, are there other matters to consider? And Be'ezer Hashem, we will continue to discuss all these subjects. My dear friends, I want to thank you all for joining us today on Sunday, the 20th of Iyar, May we only have good news out of our Holy Land, and may we only have good news from all our holy brothers and sisters, healing, health, and happiness. And if anybody's interested in taking a big schlep up to Lake Worth, 2 o'clock, we have a levaya for Larry, and because it's so far, we need extra chizuk to make sure that there is a minyan. So if anyone's interested, please message me privately.
Big loss for Montreal. Two of the Bechorim are from Montreal, Gestetner
Yes.
and Steinmetz.
Seemed like Gestetner was a budding was a musician and a father to I think 6 children, but every single one of those bios are heart wrenching.
Hi, Gott soll lupiten.
Hashem has to provide the nechama.
Wasn't there a Gestetner who came to the shul one time?
Yes, my brother's father-in-law and his wife, I suppose you could say, is Rabbi Gestetner of Jerusalem. If I'm not mistaken, they're related, they're distantly related. But we're all related. We're all related. And every one of those people are.
Alan, you have Sammy Gestetner in Montreal, big in the printing business. They were originally the copy people. Before Xerox, Gestetners.
Well, Tookie was a Gestetner. Itchy's wife.
Yeah.
Itchy's mother.
Yeah. All right, friends. Thank you all. That's
Okay,
good news. Oh, by the way, also another thing, we're going to be having a minyan. There's another family, believe it or not, if one is not enough. There's another young family that they flew to New York to take a plane to Israel. Their father just passed away. And in New York, they turned them around. They wouldn't let them on. So they're going to be sitting Shiva with our community. And so we're going to have Mincha tonight, 7:40, and Shachris throughout the week at 8 a.m. If anybody's interested in helping make sure that they have a minyan, so they can say Kaddish, that's also on the tap. Dear friends, have a wonderful day. Shkoyach.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care.
Shkoyach, Rabbi. Thank you.